My dad embezzled my college fund to finance a scam, then called me a con artist, so I exposed his stolen ledger to the entire family. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday dinner. Pot roast, my mother's good china, the kind of mundane evening where nothing happens except small talk about the unpredictable weather in Indianapolis and whether my cousin's upcoming wedding would be held outdoors. Instead, it turned into a brutal ambush I never saw coming, simply because I'd made the grave mistake of thinking that being 27 years old was old enough to finally be taken seriously by the people who raised me. My name is Elena Vance. If your own family has ever spit on the empire you built with your bare hands, stay with me, because this story does not end where you think it does. I had tried to explain my work that night at the dinner table. I tried to talk about the tech acquisitions, the real estate holdings, the startup equity I'd built from absolutely nothing over 6 grueling years of 18-hour days. My father, Arthur, cut me off before I could even finish my second sentence. "You never finished college, Elena?" he said, delivering the words like a terminal diagnosis. "You work out of coffee shops like some kind of con artist." My mother, Martha, chimed in from across the table without missing a single beat. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pursed in that familiar line of perpetual disappointment. "You'll come crawling back to us, Elena. Mark my words, you always do." I looked at both of their faces. They were smug, utterly certain, and wholly convinced they were watching a petulant child finally get put in her proper place. My mother's intricate china pattern, the one she'd been so incredibly proud of setting out that specific night, caught the warm light along its gold rim. And for one strange, suspended second, that was the singular detail my eyes fixated on instead of either of their faces. In that moment, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no hot surge of anger, no bitter tears building behind my eyes. There was just a strange, cold clarity, like a dirty window wiped completely clean after years of thick fog. I stood up slowly from the dining table. I pushed my chair in, being meticulously careful not to scrape the pristine hardwood floor my mother spent hours polishing, and I said exactly one word: "Okay." They actually laughed as I walked toward the front door. My father let out a short, satisfied bark of amusement, like he'd just won a hard-fought debate. Neither of them had any earthly idea that the coffee shop con artist they'd just humiliated had closed a massive $9.2 million acquisition deal a mere 11 days earlier. They didn't know that the lowlife they were disowning at their own dinner table held majority equity in a rapidly scaling fintech company now valued north of $250 million. I wasn't walking out in shame. I was walking out in total silence. I was heading back to a sprawling, custom-built home in Scottsdale, Arizona, that I'd paid for entirely in cash the year before, a $2.8 million house neither of them had ever been invited to see. To understand how a single phrase like low life could land with the devastating force of a judge's verdict rather than just a casual insult, you need context. You need to understand who my parents actually were before that fateful night, and who I was before I became the daughter they so casually decided to throw away like garbage. I grew up in a traditional split-level house in a deeply suburban neighborhood of Indianapolis. It was the kind of stifling cul-de-sac where every manicured lawn looked exactly the same, and every family desperately pretended their whispered kitchen table arguments were perfectly normal. My father worked 32 years as a regional logistics manager for a massive shipping conglomerate. It was the kind of deeply entrenched corporate job that gave him a solid pension, a modest company car, and an unshakable, almost religious belief that there was exactly one correct path through life. In his mind, the rules were simple: you went to a state college, you got a degree, preferably in something highly respectable like business administration or mechanical engineering. You got a corporate job with dental benefits. You retired at 65 with a gold watch and a mid-tier country club membership. Any deviation from that rigid path wasn't just unusual to him, it was a deep, personal insult. He kept a framed, black and white photo of his own father in his home office, a hardened man who'd worked the brutal assembly line at a Ford plant for 4 decades without missing a single shift. My father talked about that faded photograph far more than he ever talked about anything I actually accomplished. Stability to my father wasn't just a financial preference. It was a strict moral position. My mother had been a stay-at-home mom for the entirety of my childhood, and she measured her own intrinsic worth almost exclusively by how her children performed against the neighbors' kids. She kept a massive corkboard in our kitchen for years, meticulously pinned with school photos, honor roll certificates, and eventually, glossy wedding invitations. It was a visual scoreboard of a family doing everything correctly, updated every few months like a sacred shrine that required constant, neurotic tending. My older sister, Chloe, was their ultimate proof of concept. Chloe went to Indiana University, graduated perfectly on time with a marketing degree, married a blandly handsome man named Mark who sold commercial real estate, and settled exactly 14 minutes away in Carmel with 2 kids and a golden retriever. Chloe was the legible daughter, the one my mother could brag about at Sunday service without ever flinching. I, on the other hand, was raised to be corrected. I was supposed to follow the exact same script. I got into Purdue University during my senior year of high school, a solid, Respectable acceptance that my parents had already started planning their entire social calendar around before I'd even opened the official email. My mother even framed the acceptance letter and hung it in the main hallway right next to Chloe's diploma. I lasted exactly 3 semesters. I sat through agonizingly dull intro to microeconomics classes and required business statistics courses, feeling like I was watching someone else's mundane life unfold through a thick pane of soundproof glass. I had started discreetly trading small positions in tech stocks with my accumulated birthday money when I was just 17. By the time I hit my sophomore year of college, I was spending substantially more time devouring SEC filings and dissecting founder pitch decks than I was studying for my actual midterms. And I was making significantly more money doing it than most of my tenured professors earned in a year. I dropped out in March of what would have been my sophomore spring. I remember the exact date because it was the day I told my parents over the phone, lacking the courage to say it to their faces. March 12th. I had rehearsed the brutal call 4 times in my head while standing in the freezing parking lot of my dorm building, my jacket zipped tight against the biting Indiana wind. But no amount of rehearsal prepared me for how violently quiet the phone line went the moment I uttered the word withdrawing. My father didn't yell that day. He just went terrifyingly quiet, which, with him, was always infinitely worse. My mother cried actual, sobbing tears, the kind she usually reserved for open casket funerals. "You're throwing your entire life away," she wailed into the receiver. "You're better than working odd jobs for the rest of your life, Elena." I wasn't working odd jobs. I was building a sophisticated investment portfolio. But there was absolutely no explaining that to 2 stubborn people who firmly believed a piece of parchment was the sole proof that a human being had any value. For the next 4 years, I lived on a razor's edge of poverty. I rented a suffocating, windowless studio apartment above a 24-hour laundromat in Broad Ripple for $1,200 a month. The constant thrum of the industrial washing machines below vibrated through my floorboards, a relentless mechanical heartbeat that soundtracked my sleepless nights. For the first 8 months, I didn't even own a bed frame. My mattress lay directly on the scuffed linoleum, because buying furniture felt like a dangerous distraction from the empire I was desperately trying to build. I survived on the same $4 instant ramen and day-old bagels so often that the local bodega owner started handing them to me out of pity. I taught myself advanced financial modeling from blurry YouTube videos and secondhand textbooks I bought for pennies from a dusty used bookstore near the campus I no longer attended. I cold emailed 52 different startup founders before one of them, a brilliant woman named Sarah Jenkins, who was running an early-stage payment processing startup out of Chicago, finally agreed to let me help with her investor relations in exchange for a small equity stake instead of a traditional salary. I remember the exact wording of Sarah's reply because I read it so many times the glass screen of my phone practically wore thin. "I can't pay you what your brain is worth yet, but I can give you a piece of what this company becomes." That struggling little company became Apex Ledger. 4 years later, when a massive private equity firm bought a controlling stake, my tiny 2% founder-adjacent equity position was suddenly worth just under $11 million on paper. I never told my parents any of this. I kept my mouth shut partly because I knew they wouldn't believe me, and partly because some small, deeply stubborn part of my soul wanted to see exactly how long they would keep assuming the absolute worst about me without ever asking a single genuine question. There was an incident back when I was 24 that perfectly encapsulated their disdain. My father hosted a massive neighborhood barbecue. A neighbor, Mr. Henderson, politely asked what I did for work. Before I could even open my mouth to explain my advisory roles, my father answered for me. "Elena does internet stuff," he said, letting out a condescending chuckle that echoed across the patio. "Some kind of glorified receptionist thing, I think. She's still finding her way." I stood there, gripping a flimsy paper plate of potato salad so hard it nearly snapped, while a dozen people nodded with polite pity and quickly moved the conversation along. I drove home that night replaying the humiliation on an endless loop. That was the exact moment I quietly stopped bringing up my career around him altogether. If he wasn't going to listen, I wasn't going to hand him the ammunition to dismiss me. By the time I turned 27, I had fully relocated to Scottsdale, Arizona. I closed on a sprawling, modern 4-bedroom estate on a golf course for $2.8 million. I paid for it in a single, massive wire transfer that made the escrow agent do a visible double take over her spectacles. I remember standing in the cavernous, empty living room the day I finally got the keys, the blinding desert sunlight pouring across the imported hardwood floors, and thinking about that filthy mattress on the floor above the laundromat. I told my parents I was coming home to Indianapolis for a visit, mostly because Chloe had been begging me for over a year, and some pathetic, hopeful part of my inner child still wanted to see if things could miraculously be different. Hope is an incredibly expensive currency when you spend it on people who have already decided exactly who you are. The Sunday dinner where they finally threw me out wasn't the first time they'd tried to bring me to heel, but it was the one that finally broke the camel's back. Halfway through the meal, My father spent 20 minutes relentlessly needling me about a professional LinkedIn post I'd shared regarding a major financial deal I'd advised on. He asked me, pointedly and loudly in front of my sister and her husband Mark, whether I was still playing pretend on the computer or if I was finally going to go back and finish my degree. I tried one last time. I mentioned the fintech company. I mentioned the staggering $250 million valuation. My mother actually scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound of sheer disbelief. $250 million, Elena? Honestly, the delusional lies you tell yourself just to avoid getting a real job. Then came the low-life comment from my father, then came the pointing finger. But there was one tiny, seemingly insignificant detail from that dinner that I didn't think much of at the time, but which would later become the explosive catalyst for everything that followed. Right before my father started yelling, his smartphone had buzzed face up on the dining table. I caught a fleeting glimpse of the lock screen notification before he frantically snatched it and flipped it over. It was a banking app alert. A bright red exclamation mark sat next to an account name I had never seen before, Vance Family Trust. I remember thinking briefly that I had never heard of a Vance Family Trust in my entire life. But then the screaming started, the insult was hurled, and I forgot about it entirely. I walked out of that house, drove to the airport hotel, booked a first-class flight back to Arizona for the next morning, and slept better than I had in a decade. Update 1. 3 weeks passed in near total, blissful silence. I threw myself violently into my work, flying to Austin to close a complex merger for a new client, spending 12 days living out of luxury hotels so I wouldn't have time to sit still with the emotional wreckage of that dinner. Then, the frantic phone calls started. 18 missed calls in a single week, every single one of them from my mother's number. Not a single one of the voicemails contained an apology. Instead, they contained pure, unadulterated panic. The bank had suddenly frozen their primary checking account. Their beloved house on the cul-de-sac, the one they'd proudly owned outright for over 15 years, was abruptly headed toward immediate foreclosure. Their entire retirement fund, the massive nest egg my father had aggressively bragged about for decades as his crowning achievement of fiscal discipline, had apparently been invested blindly through a financial advisor a church friend had recommended. A sleazy, fast-talking man named Marcus Thorne. The investment had turned out to be a massive, illegal Ponzi scheme built on nothing but forged statements and empty promises. Every single penny was gone. The very same woman who had coldly told me I would come crawling back to them was now leaving hyperventilating voicemails that started with "sweetie" and ended with "please, Elena, it's a total emergency. Call me back immediately." I didn't call back. A week later, they showed up at the heavily gated entrance of my community in Scottsdale entirely unannounced, having driven over 1,400 miles across the country without so much as a warning text. The community security guard called my cell. "Miss Vance, there's an older couple at the main gate. They're driving a gray sedan, and claiming to be your parents. They're demanding entry." I told the guard, in the calmest voice I could muster, to inform them that I was completely unavailable and to deny them access. I watched the gate's security footage later that evening, sitting alone on my massive leather sofa with a glass of expensive Cabernet I barely touched. My father paced in furious, erratic circles near the guardhouse, his hands jammed deep into his pockets, his jaw tight with the impotent rage of a man who suddenly realized he had zero control. My mother sat in the passenger seat, aggressively wiping at her eyes with a tissue, glaring at the security camera. They stayed parked outside my gate for almost 2 hours before finally giving up and driving away. That night, my father texted me for the first time in a month. "We're severely struggling, Elena. Just a small loan to get us through this nightmare. We'll pay you back with interest." I stared at the glowing screen, feeling that same icy clarity I'd felt the night he pointed at the door. I typed back exactly 6 words. "I thought I was a low life." Delivered. Read. No response ever came. The silence didn't last long. The flying monkeys were deployed. Now, a cousin of my mother's, a loudmouthed woman named Brenda whom I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, tracked down my business email and sent a scathing, multi-paragraph message accusing me of abandoning my elderly parents in their darkest hour of need, as though I were the one who had recklessly gambled away their life savings. Then my sister Chloe called. Her voice on the phone was trembling and exhausted, softer than I'd heard it since we were children. "They're really not okay, Elle," she pleaded. "Dad is having severe panic attacks. Mom is barely eating a thing. I don't know how to fix this." "Do you remember what Mom called me at that dinner?" I asked quietly. "Do you remember what Dad screamed in my face while you sat there and watched?" A suffocating silence stretched across the line. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice cracking. "I remember." "Then answer this honestly," I demanded. "If the bank account hadn't frozen, and if the house wasn't being foreclosed on, would either of them have ever called me? Would you have called me?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. We both knew the ugly truth. They didn't miss me. They missed the obedient, punching bag version of me who absorbed every insult without ever striking back, and that version of me was dead and buried. By the following weekend, A prominent regional business magazine ran a massive cover feature on my company's latest acquisition, and my name was plastered right in the headline: From College Dropout to Fintech Powerhouse. How to 7-year-old Elena Vance built a $52 million fortune from scratch. My parents saw the article. Of course they did. Chloe sent me a screenshot of their family group chat, the exact same chat I had been quietly booted from 2 years prior. My mother had written, "She's deliberately embarrassing us publicly with all this flashy attention. It's so tacky." My father had replied, "Always was a desperate performer, even as a kid. Money doesn't buy class." Even after a respected magazine put their own daughter's monumental success in print for the entire state to read, neither of them could muster a single, solitary syllable of pride. That screenshot told me everything I ever needed to know. But the hypocrisy didn't end there. Later that evening, a text came through from my father's number. "We saw the beautiful article. We are so incredibly proud of you, Elena. Can we please come see you? We need to talk about the future." The word proud looked grotesque coming from him, like a stolen garment that didn't fit. I didn't reply. The very next Monday, my corporate lawyer, a ruthless, brilliant woman named Jessica Cole, called me with something I genuinely hadn't anticipated. My parents knew, desperate financial advisor had formally reached out through official legal channels, politely inquiring about securing a massive, low-interest, private loan against my personal company holdings, structured carefully, so it wouldn't appear as a direct charity gift to spare my father's fragile ego. I let the silence stretch on the phone for a long moment before I spoke. "Jessica, send them my standard corporate lending rates, 18% interest, fully collateralized, strictly business. Absolutely no family discount." Jessica laughed a sharp, predatory sound and told me she had never enjoyed drafting a rejection letter more in her entire career. Update 2. I thought the absolute worst of the drama was behind me. I thought the foreclosure and the public humiliation were the final chapters of this miserable saga. I was entirely wrong. The real bomb hadn't even detonated yet. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my assistant buzzed my office intercom. "Miss Vance, your sister Chloe is in the lobby. She flew in from Indiana. She looks extremely distressed and says it's a literal emergency." I almost told security to turn her away. But something about the sheer desperation of a cross-country flight made me walk out to the sleek, marble-floored lobby myself. Chloe looked terrifyingly small. The dark, bruised shadows under her eyes spoke of weeks without sleep. She was clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were stark white. We walked in silence to a private glass-walled conference room overlooking the mountains. Before she even sat down, she unzipped her bag and pulled out a thick, battered manila folder with shaking hands. "I almost didn't bring this," she choked out, tears instantly spilling over her lashes. "I found it buried in a locked drawer in Dad's home office. I was just looking for the original property deed because the foreclosure attorney desperately needed it, and I found this instead. Elena, you need to look at it." She slid the heavy folder across the glass table. I opened it. Inside was a massive stack of legal documents. The header on the first page read, "Vance Family Trust." It was the exact same name I had briefly glimpsed on my father's phone screen during that disastrous Sunday dinner. I started reading, and with every page I turned, the blood drained further from my face. The trust had been established nearly 10 years earlier, initially funded with $75,000 from our late grandmother's estate after she passed away. According to the explicitly written legal paperwork, that money was legally earmarked to be split perfectly equally between my father, his younger brother Uncle Robert, and his sister Aunt Clara. Except, the money had never been split. My father had quietly manipulated the legal paperwork to become the sole, unchecked trustee. Over the following decade, he had systematically and illegally redirected massive withdrawals from that trust directly into his and my mother's personal checking accounts. Chloe's extravagant, $40,000 wedding 4 years earlier, the one my parents constantly bragged they had paid for out of their careful, lifelong savings? It had actually been funded almost entirely by stolen trust money that rightfully belonged to Aunt Clara and Uncle Robert, but that wasn't the detail that made my stomach violently drop. Buried 5 pages deeper in the thick folder was a separate document, an old, yellowed handwritten accounting ledger in my father's unmistakable, sharp cursive handwriting. It listed dates, withdrawal amounts, and a running column of his personal justifications. My eyes locked onto a specific entry. Next to a massive withdrawal of $10,000, dated the exact same month and year I had dropped out of Purdue University, my father had written a single, damning sentence. "Ease tuition refund redirect. She won't need it, she's a complete failure anyway." My breath caught in my throat. He had known. He had intercepted the massive tuition refund check from the university when I withdrew. He had pulled the $10,000 that was meant for my education, quietly funneled it into his own secret accounts, and then spent the next 6 years loudly telling anyone who would listen that I had carelessly thrown away the golden opportunities he had so graciously provided me. The narrative he spun to the world and to me was that I had wasted his generosity. The horrifying truth, sitting right there in permanent blue ink, was that he had literally stolen my money, used it to fund his fake, wealthy suburban lifestyle, and then sadistically punished me for a theft he himself had committed. And it got worse. The final section of the folder detailed a series of catastrophic, highly leveraged loans my father had personally guaranteed against the trust's remaining balance to cover his entry into Marcus Thorne's Ponzi scheme. My father hadn't just been a naive, innocent victim of a scam as my mother had tearfully claimed. He had been an eager, greedy participant, frantically chasing an unrealistic 20% annual return, moving both his own money and his siblings' stolen inheritance into the collapsing scheme without ever telling them their futures were riding on his reckless bet. I sat in that silent conference room, the desert sun beating against the glass, and felt the entire architectural foundation of my childhood completely collapse. "Does Uncle Robert know?" I asked Chloe, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "No," she sobbed into her hands. "Nobody knows. Just us." I didn't hesitate. I called Jessica immediately. She reviewed the scanned documents overnight and confirmed my darkest suspicions. This wasn't just a toxic family secret. It was a massive, legally actionable breach of fiduciary duty. It was a felony. 3 days later, I flew back to Indianapolis. I asked Chloe to arrange a mandatory family meeting at Aunt Clara's house, framing it strictly as a discussion about the impending foreclosure. I wanted my father walking into that room entirely unprepared. I wanted him walking in exactly the way I had walked into that Sunday dinner, believing he still held all the power. We gathered in Aunt Clara's cramped, floral-papered living room. My father sat aggressively on the sofa, looking thinner and significantly older, the severe stress of the foreclosure carved deeply into his face. My mother sat beside him, nervously twisting her wedding ring. Uncle Robert had driven up from Bloomington. Chloe sat rigidly in the corner. I didn't say hello. I didn't offer small talk. I simply reached into my leather tote bag, pulled out the thick manila folder, and dropped it onto the wooden coffee table with a heavy, echoing thud. "I want to talk about the Vance family trust," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. My father's face instantly lost all color. His eyes darted to the folder, panic erupting in his chest so violently I could almost see his heart pounding through his shirt. Where did you get that?" he stammered, his confident facade instantly vaporizing. "It doesn't matter," I replied coldly. "What matters is that Grandma left $75,000 to be split equally between you, Clara, and Robert. What matters is that you secretly made yourself sole trustee and never told either of them." Aunt Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Uncle Robert leaned forward, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. I didn't stop. I turned the pages, my voice rising in volume and intensity. "What matters is that you stole $10,000 from my college refund the same month I dropped out. You wrote she won't need it, she's a failure in your own ledger, and then you spent the next 6 years calling me a low-life for not having a degree you actively stole the funding for." "Arthur, what is she talking about?" Uncle Robert demanded, his voice dangerously low. My father didn't look at his brother. He looked at me, a desperate, cornered animal. "I was managing the money responsibly," he shouted, a pathetic attempt at maintaining authority. "I was trying to grow the family wealth. I did what I thought was best. You gambled Robert and Clara's inheritance on an illegal Ponzi scheme." I screamed back, the years of suppressed rage finally detonating. "You lost every single penny of it. And then you had the absolute audacity to call your own daughter a con artist for building a legitimate company, while you were quietly running a pathetic embezzlement scheme of your own." Uncle Robert stood up. He was a large man, and his sheer physical presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He didn't yell. He just looked down at his older brother with absolute, unadulterated disgust. "I trusted you with our mother's money, Arthur. For 10 years. My father shrank into the sofa cushions. He turned to me, his eyes wide and pleading. "You've made your point, Elena. You've won. Is that what this is about? Proving to everyone that you're better than me?" I looked at the man who had tormented me for my entire adult life, and I felt nothing but profound pity. "This was never a contest, Dad. I didn't build my company to prove you wrong. I built it because it was mine. You just happened to be the person standing in the doorway, desperately trying to tell me I couldn't." I turned around and walked out of the house. I didn't look back. The aftermath was swift and brutally absolute. Uncle Robert and Aunt Clara retained a vicious litigation attorney within 48 hours. The trust became the immediate subject of a massive formal legal review. My father was officially stripped of his trustee status. A court-ordered forensic accounting of the missing funds went into motion, though everyone involved fully understood that the money swallowed by Marcus Thorne's collapsed scheme was gone forever. The foreclosure on my parents' pristine suburban house went through without delay. They were violently evicted on a freezing Tuesday in November. They were forced to downsize into a cramped, dingy 2-bedroom apartment in a severely run-down part of the city, the exact kind of neighborhood my mother used to openly mock at her country club luncheons. My father desperately tried one final, pathetic move. He reached out to a local business journalist, hoping to plant a fabricated sob story about how he was just a misunderstood father who made a minor financial error, and how his cruel, billionaire daughter was needlessly punishing him. The journalist, doing her basic due diligence, called my PR team first. We sent her a single PDF of the court filings regarding the Embezzled trust. My father's fake narrative died a humiliating death before it ever reached the printing press. It's been 8 months since that explosive confrontation in Aunt Clara's living room. I still live in my beautiful Scottsdale home. My company's valuation has only continued to skyrocket. I talk to my sister Chloe every single Sunday now, discovering our father's true nature somehow shattered the toxic rivalry our mother had violently forced upon us, and we are finally building a real relationship. I haven't spoken a single word to my parents since that day. I never will again. I used to think that achieving a massive net worth would be the ultimate thing that finally silenced every cruel doubt my father ever planted in my head. It wasn't. What finally silenced the doubt was realizing that the man whose approval I had spent 27 years desperately begging for was nothing more than a pathetic, insecure thief who was terrified of his own daughter's potential. He called me a lowlife, certain the word would define me forever. It didn't. In the end, it defined him. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out and allows us to bring you even more awesome stories. Thank you so much for watching.